Greetings and welcome to the University of Minnesota Alumni Association's webinar series. My name is John Ruzek and I'm the Senior Director of Alumni Networks and your host today. Thanks to all the alumni and friends who have made time to join us live. We have a great topic coming up today from a great faculty member here at the U of M, Addiction 101, Myths and Misconceptions. And we'll get to that in just a few minutes, have a couple housekeeping items. Today's webinar is part of an ongoing free series being offered by the University of Minnesota Alumni Association, where we're having presentations with experts about career life and learning topics. I actually just did the math today and added up to date since October 2014. We've had over 6,000 alumni and friends join us live for these webinars, which is completely outstanding, and have had over 14,000 YouTube views of the series. And initiatives like these are made possible in part by our Alumni Association members. So thank you so much. Because of your support, we can create these powerful opportunities for students, friends, and more than 466,000 alumni around the world. And if you're interested in joining the Alumni Association, visit us at umnalumni.org/membership. We have some upcoming webinars, actually one on Thursday this week on brass tacks budgeting, using a budget to gain financial control, and then some career-related ones in late March and April that you see there. And if you'd like to register for those, please visit umnalumni.org/virtual. Just a few housekeeping items about using GoToWebinar, which you've used to log in today. You have joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you'd prefer to listen over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane of your GoToWebinar panel and dial-in information will be displayed. If you experience audio difficulties listening via your computer speakers, this might be caused by having multiple applications open, perhaps listening over a wireless signal. So if that's the case, please close any unnecessary applications you have open, or perhaps move to a hardwired internet connection versus wireless. Our presenter was kind enough today to make a PDF available of the presentation. If you'd like to download that via the GoToWebinar control panel, you should see a section called Handouts. And the slides are available in a PDF. And if you for some reason can't navigate that off the GoToWebinar control panel, I'll be sending that out with the recording a few days after today, as far as to all registrants. So if you can't figure it out right now, we will get it to you by email afterwards. And there will be points along the way where the presenter will ask for questions that you might have. And if that's something of interest, feel free to type it in the questions pane on the GoToWebinar control panel. We'd love to hear from you. And hopefully it will be an engaging conversation today. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's featured speaker. Amy Krentzman joined the University of Minnesota School of Social Work in the fall of 2013. She came to Minnesota after 2 consecutive postdoctoral research fellowships at the University of Michigan Addiction Research Center. She received her PhD in social welfare from the Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences at Case Western Reserve University, her Master of Social Work from New York University Silver School of Social Work, and her BA in English Literature from Northwestern University. Dr. Krentzman's research focuses on factors that promote the initiation and maintenance of recovery from alcoholism, particularly the mechanisms of therapeutic change that are precipitated by professional treatment, recovery community organizations, and Alcoholics Anonymous. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Amy Krentzman. Welcome, Amy.
Oh, thank you so much, John, and thanks to all the alumni who are listening in at this moment. It's my great pleasure to be a faculty member in your university and to address you this lunch hour. I believe that very shortly I'm going to be able to start showing you my slides.
Yep, just send it.
So we're just going to do the technical maneuvering we need to do here so that we can begin the slideshow.
All right, I see it.
Wonderful. Well, thanks to you, John, for all the back and forth and the odds and ends we had to organize to be ready for today. And I want to thank Nancy Lowe, who is an IT specialist sitting by my side today, just to make sure everything goes very smoothly for the benefit of our talk this lunch hour. And as John mentioned, our talk is about addiction myths and misconceptions. And before we move on to the topic at hand, just a few things I'd like to say. One is, just to give you a picture of where I am physically at this moment, I am in the School of Social Work. That is on the St. Paul campus, and I'm in the building Peters Hall. That's where I sit right now at this moment. John is on the East Bank. I'm here in St. Paul. Across the bottom banner of my PowerPoint slides, you're going to see the number 100. That's because this year is the School of Social Work's 100th anniversary. Just a little tiny bit more about me. That's me there on the left. You might have seen me come through your mailbox. So I speak to you today about addiction from the knowledge that I have gained as a researcher on the subject of addiction and as an instructor on the topic of addiction here in the School of Social Work. I focus my research on the topic of addiction recovery, and the phenomenon of addiction recovery, the fact that many people recover from addiction. And as such, the topics I have researched include things like spirituality, gratitude, forgiveness, 12-step programs such as Alcoholics Anonymous, sober living houses, and I have a current study underway about the experience of recovery from addiction in rural Minnesota. And again, I also teach here at the School of Social Work. I teach a course called Substance Abuse and Social Work, a 2-credit elective. So I come to you from the knowledge base of having been an instructor in this field, a researcher in this field, and a former, even many moons ago, a former substance abuse counselor. So before we talk about what we will talk about today, before we hit our topic of myths and misconceptions, there is just a couple of quick other things I wanted to furnish for you. And I wanted to actually say a few words about something we won't talk about because, of course, I'm addressing you today taking 40 minutes to cover a subject that's really quite vast. You know, addiction is an enormous topic, so there'll be many things we won't have a chance to talk about today. But two important ones I just wanted to give some very quick time to, and one is if you are interested in the opiate epidemic, then I highly recommend this work of nonfiction called Dreamland by Sam Quinones. So again, if you're interested in the opiate epidemic, I am really enjoying this read. It's just fantastic work. It goes into such depth to explain what's going on, although for the rest of the webinar, we won't be focusing on that topic. Another thing we won't be talking about in depth in our webinar today is if we are worried about a friend or a loved one. So I just want to take a quick minute to recommend a couple of resources if that it might be your situation, your reason for logging in with us this lunchtime, or if you know someone who's worried about the addiction of a loved one. I think the book Love First by Jeff and Deborah J. I quite liked this book. It talks to the family members, addresses the family members, and talks about some tips for family members who have a loved one who is addicted. I also recommend the self-help group called Al-Anon, and on the right-hand side there of the screen you see a PDF that you can download for free called Al-Anon Faces Alcoholism. I recommend this piece to my students in the class that I teach, and the students learn from reading this that Al-Anon is not just for people whose relatives are alcoholics, but Al-Anon is for anyone who has a friend or loved one whose drinking bothers them. So that friend or loved one doesn't have to meet that threshold of having an alcoholism or an alcohol use disorder. If their drinking bothers the person, then the person is free to take advantage of what Al-Anon has to offer. And a great way to find that is, of course, this free download on the right-hand side, and also just exploring the Al-Anon website can be a wonderful resource. So with those two sort of public service announcements, we'll move forward with our topic at hand, which is what makes addiction so rife with myths and misconceptions? Why is it so poorly misunderstood? So I'm going to give you some of my ideas on that question. First, addiction is confusing and bewildering human behavior. People act in ways that are really quite baffling when they have the problem of addiction. And I think some of the reasons that make it so confusing for many of us is that addiction is and is not like other conditions that we are more familiar with, other chronic health conditions, other mental health conditions, but it's different. It's sort of in a class by itself. It's not exactly like those other conditions. So we might think of it as being exactly like another chronic condition like diabetes, but it's different, or another mental illness, but like depression, but it's different. So I think that can cause confusion. Another thing that can be confusing about addiction is that the onset of addiction can be quite gradual. That's not true of everyone. Sometimes the onset is very, very sudden over a short period of time, but for many, the onset can be gradual, and it's earlier, less severe stages. The problems can be intermittent rather than consistent. So a family member might become quite worried, and then they might feel like things are better now. The person isn't so bad. And then an episode happens where the person is again quite worried. And I think that's why addiction is so very hard on family members and friends, because of this intermittent pattern that seems to mark its earlier stages. There's still quite a bit of shame and stigma attached to addiction. We'll be going into that in the further slides, but I think that can cause some misunderstanding. And in addition, there are aspects of addiction that are controversial. There are very strong feelings about things like, should we treat addiction with abstinence or harm reduction? And there can sometimes be very polarized camps that have extremely passionate, strong feelings about these topics. You might be familiar with Alcoholics Anonymous, which you might be aware has a spiritual component, and some people have very strong feelings about that. So there are some aspects that are controversial, and I think that adds to misunderstanding. And finally, this is a hobby of mine, nothing I've done research on, but we'll be talking about it at this hour we'll share together. I believe we get very mixed messages about addiction and about addiction recovery from popular culture. And I have several slides today to show you with examples from popular culture. So no matter where I am in this series of slides, at 12:40, I'm going to get to the popular culture stuff, because while I think all of this is fascinating, the popular culture stuff is, to me, the most fun and interesting to look at. So we won't run out of time and not get to that. We're going to advance our slides and get to that no matter what by 12:40. So these are some of the reasons I feel addiction can be confusing, and so this webinar is designed to dismantle maybe some of these myths, and I hope that everyone listening in will learn at least one or two things that you didn't know before. And I'm an educator, so I'd be thrilled if you learned 10 things you didn't know before. Basically, our agenda is I'm going to talk about a little bit about what is addiction, what is recovery, and there'll be some myth busting along the way. And finally, we'll get to the topic of addiction in popular culture. So moving along, we'll start with the topic of what is addiction, and I want to start with something you might be familiar with called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And here's a stack of old versions of this manual. The manual is published by the American Psychiatric Association. It's been updated over time, which is why you see these different versions in the image. And basically, it sets out the standard criteria for the classification of mental disorders, and addiction is considered a mental disorder. So they lay out the specific criteria and a clear line in the sand that determines when someone develops, the moment when someone develops an alcohol use disorder or a substance use disorder. As I'll be showing you, in fact, let's do that now. There are 11 criteria for meeting a diagnosis per the DSM manual that I showed you here. The DSM manual, the current version, version 5, lays out 11 criteria for meeting a diagnosis of alcohol use disorder. And I know this type is very small, and that in some ways was on purpose. I know small type on a slide can be a little bit aggravating, and it's not, we won't be reading through this word by word. I just wanted to illustrate that there are 11 criteria, And the line in the sand is, if a person meets at least 2 of these criteria, they will meet diagnosis for an alcohol use disorder. Now, alcohol use disorder is the technical term. The lay term is alcoholism, but alcoholism isn't a clinical or medical term. The term is alcohol use disorder. So we're going to look at these 11 criteria, and the way these work is the person doing the diagnosis would have a technique for interviewing the person and finding out how many of these 11 criteria they meet or don't meet. So for each one, it would be kind of like check mark, they meet this one, or no, they don't meet this one. And so they'd be able to take an inventory of these 11 items and count up. At the end, they literally would count up how many of the 11 are true for this person, and that helps them make the diagnosis. So to present these criteria to you, I did something a little bit novel that I actually hadn't done before, but I found interesting. Instead of reading them out to you one by one, I took all 11 criteria and I put them in a qualitative data analytics software program, and I coded the criteria for themes that run through and across the 11 criteria. And I found 4 themes. 1, physiological dependence. 2, drinking causes trouble. 3, drinking interferes with other aspects of life. And 4, loss of control. We'll go over these in a little more depth because understanding the symptoms of addiction, or in this case an alcohol use disorder, addiction to alcohol, will help us understand the nature of addiction. So let's go through these in just a little bit more depth. Physiological dependence, there are 2 criteria that deal with this. This means that the body has become physically addicted to alcohol. So it's more than just a psychological need or a psychological dependence at this stage. And that's when someone meets the criteria for tolerance. They need more and more of the substance, in this case alcohol, to achieve the same results. So whereas they used to just have 2 or 3 drinks and start to feel the effect, now they need more than that. It's because the body physiologically has developed tolerance and more of the substance is needed to achieve the same effects. Also in this category is the idea of withdrawal, that when the effects of alcohol wear off, the person exhibits the customary and standard symptoms of a withdrawal symptom from alcohol. And those kinds of symptoms are things like trouble sleeping, shakiness, restlessness, nausea, sweating, a racing heart, a seizure, or a sense that things are not not there. A sense that things are there that are really not there, a hallucination. So this category indicates that the body has developed a physical addiction. The other theme I found in the 11 criteria is this theme that addiction causes trouble. It causes trouble with social networks, with family members and friends and people on the workplace. It causes physical trouble. In other words, there is quite a bit of an acute risk. If someone is intoxicated, they could hurt themselves. They could fall. They could have an accident. They could have a car crash, and they could injure themselves. This is not the result of a chronic use of addiction. It could happen even with a single episode of intoxication. And finally, drinking causes trouble with mental health. So it could worsen depression or anxiety, and it could cause what's called a blackout, which is a memory loss, where a person is so intoxicated that they, even though they're still walking around, they're still unfortunately maybe driving a car, they're still sitting up. They're not flat out lying down with their eyes closed. They're still walking around, but they will have no memory of that episode afterward because alcohol has made it impossible for those memories to become long-term memories. Another theme running through the 11 criteria is that drinking interferes with other aspects of life. And here I want to use this very colorful pie chart as kind of like our metaphor to examine this idea. So suppose that suppose the pie chart represents 24 hours in a day of life. So maybe that big blue slice in the bottom represents the hours that we spend sleeping, and maybe the green slice represents the hours we spend at work. And some of those other slices might be chores we run, errands we run, hobbies we have, such as making quilts or going fishing, spending time with family. But what happens with addiction is one of those slices becomes using the addictive substance. So it includes planning to drink, going shopping for alcohol, actually drinking and recovering from its effects. And that starts to take time out of one's life. In this illustration, time out of just, for example, 24 hours in one's life. So let's say that the large purple wedge at the top represents drinking behavior. And as drinking problem progresses, it's going to take up more and more time, and it's going that slice of the pie is going to widen, and it's going to squeeze out the other areas of life, and people will no longer have time for other hobbies and activities they used to enjoy, because more and more of their existence is taken up by drinking behavior. And the fourth theme that I found running through the 11 criteria is the theme of loss of control. And that's drinking more than intended. So maybe a person goes to a bar and they decide, I'm going to just have one and go home. But after they have one, they change their intention and they say, no, I'm going to have another one and another. And that person could end up closing the bar and being asked to leave because the bar is closing. They didn't mean to stay all night. They didn't mean to drink all night, but they did. And that will happen, but here's where it becomes confusing. That will happen sometimes, not always. Sometimes they will go in and have one drink and leave, and other times they will go in and they won't really be able to stop, or they won't want to stop. And it's unpredictable whether it would be scenario A or scenario B, whether they could drink what they intend or overdrink, if you will. They won't really be able to predict what's going to happen once they drink. This is the idea of loss of control. The other idea is having trouble cutting down or stopping. Because there is this increasing loss of control, the person might implement some rules about their drinking, like, okay, no more drinking at lunchtime, or no more drinking after 5 on Sunday. And they'll make rules because they're having trouble controlling it. If they had no trouble controlling it, there'd be no need to make such rules. And then the rules, they're unable to stick within the rule boundaries that they might set. They try to stop and they resume drinking, and this represents loss of control. So I hope you've enjoyed sort of like looking at the 11 criteria through this way we're cutting through it according to themes, rather than looking at each of the 11, but they are in the handout if you want to study them in more depth. I found this image online, and I thought it spoke to much that we've just been discussing related to addiction. When you can stop, you don't want to, and when you want to stop, you can't. So this suggests at an earlier stage in the addictive process, the person would be able to stop, but they wouldn't want to stop. And then at a later stage, a more severe stage, when they wanted to stop, they couldn't. So addiction is really like nothing else. In my opinion, it's in a class by itself. So it is like diabetes, hypertension, or asthma, in that it is a chronic health condition requiring continuing care over a lifetime. A literature review demonstrated that these illnesses, that is diabetes, hypertension, asthma, and addiction, have similar rates of heritability. We inherited predisposition for these conditions genetically. Similar rates of treatment compliance. We think of people with substance use disorders as being terribly non-compliant, but it turns out they're just as non-compliant as folks with these other conditions. Equal rates of relapse. Again, we feel that people with addictions have a terrible rate of relapse, and they do, but it's no worse than these other conditions. And similar issues relating to personal responsibility and what a person could do to help themselves be well. However, interestingly, when individuals relapse after treatment in diabetes, hypertension, or asthma, it is attributed to treatment success. So when someone doesn't do well when treatment ends with those conditions, they said, see, treatment was working, so let's put treatment back online for these people now. But for addiction, if someone has treatment and then they relapse, for some reason socially we perceive this as a treatment failure. See, treatment didn't work, the person is using substances again. So I think this is pretty interesting and speaks to why there can be some confusion around this thing that's addiction and is like nothing else. Addiction is like mental illness in that it is a brain disease. And it's like an allergy. You could think there has some similarities to an allergy, but only to a point. Think of how we treat people with allergies versus how we treat people who tell us that they don't drink. If you meet someone who doesn't drink, it's very, very common that that person will receive a litany of questions about this very odd thing. Okay, they don't ever drink, not ever. Oh, that's odd and curious. They can get these kind of questions like, really, you never drink ever? Or wouldn't you even have one sip? How about just a very small amount? Or how about on New Year's Eve? You mean you don't ever drink, not even on New Year's Eve? And not even at a wedding? What about at your wedding? You wouldn't drink even then? Or it's been a while since you drank. Couldn't you safely have one now? So someone in recovery from an alcohol use disorder is someone who no longer drinks at all ever, under any circumstances, in any amount, under any conditions. That's their lifestyle. The maintenance of their recovery is based on that choice of abstinence. But they can very often get these kinds of questions. But if you think of someone who tells you, I have a peanut allergy, right? We never turn to someone with a peanut allergy and say, really, you can never have a peanut ever? Can't you have just a little piece of a peanut? Not even a peanut on New Year's Eve? So again, like this idea of allergy, it doesn't have these social connections that drinking has. Not even a peanut, even if it's your wedding, or it's been a while since you had a peanut. Wouldn't you be okay to have one now? We would never say anything like that to someone with a peanut allergy or a shellfish allergy. We would just make sure that person was far away from peanuts and shellfish. We would never press. We would never offer. I mean, it would be very, very different. So the two ideas are received in a social context very differently in ways that I think are fascinating. And in accordance with what I had mentioned earlier, addiction can really be a flashpoint. There's much that we agree on. I think the majority of people would agree that addiction is a costly social problem. I don't think there's any conflict or controversy around that individuals with addictions and their families and their friends suffer greatly. I think we may all, or the large majority of us, may agree that that's true. And we may all agree that many achieve stable long-term recovery. That's absolutely true and not controversial. But there is much that we passionately disagree about. Things like abstinence, complete abstinence, or moderation. What should we shoot for? This idea of natural recovery has appeared in the research literature. That is that the person with an addiction just suddenly no longer has an addiction anymore. And it is not the result of treatment or Alcoholics Anonymous. It just resolves on its own, which is a phenomenon that some researchers have captured. Alcoholics Anonymous, as mentioned earlier, can be a flashpoint because of its talk of spirituality, a higher power, having had a spiritual awakening, the idea of use of prayer in the service of addiction recovery, the word God is used. People have very strong feelings about this. And again, in a treatment modality, abstinence versus harm reduction, there can be strong feelings on either way. In addition, there is much shame and stigma still associated with addiction, even though since the 1950s, the American Medical Association has determined that addiction is a disease, it's an illness, and yet still it's hard to shake shame and stigma. In an obituary or at a funeral, you might hear that the cause of death is depression or suicide, and those terrible conditions are actually a euphemism sometimes when the real cause of death was addiction, but that people would rather say anything else but to say that the loved one passed from addiction. And it's hard to shake this idea that addiction is a sin or a moral failing, which it is not. It is a physiological illness and a disease, but it's still sort of hard to shake the idea that it isn't a weakness, and why can't the person just stop? For some reason, it's very hard to shake that. And the idea of stigma and addiction is very pervasive throughout the experience of drinking abstinence and addiction and recovery. Having an active addiction is stigmatizing. Being in recovery from active addiction is stigmatizing, although that is starting to change, that I'll talk about in a few slides. Being a non-drinker in some social circles is also stigmatizing, so it's almost like you can't win. There is a study I read, a qualitative study of non-drinking college students. So these are college students who attended a medium-sized state university in the Midwest with 20,000 students. And as we know, college student drinking is a social problem, a problem of quite a bit of concern. And some colleges have quite a culture of heavy drinking as the norm. And in those cultures, the student who chooses abstinence from drinking for whatever reason could be stigmatized. And Herman Kinney and Kinney did a qualitative study of such students and their perceptions as non-drinking as deviant. And I just want to read you a quick quote from one of their research participants who themselves, the persons who spoke out the quote on the next slide, themselves is someone for whom they do not drink. Okay, this person who speaks this quote that I'll read to you now is someone who doesn't drink. We'd gather up all the red cups we could find with leftover booze in them, consolidate them into a few cups, and throw them in the faces of our targets. They would target individuals coming out of a sober party on campus and people who were in non-drinking events. And as they would leave the event, this group would throw alcohol on them. Now that I look back on it, I was joining in with bullies just to protect my reputation. I tried to pass myself off as one of them. Those guys had no idea I did not drink. I fooled them all right. But inside, after the fact, I'd sometimes feel sick to my stomach that I was really one of those very kids that we were harassing. So this is a description of actually violently assaulting and harassing and badgering and bullying people who just simply choose not to drink. So it just speaks to how pervasive and how bewildering really this whole topic is. In addition, there's even more that's odd and inexplicable. For example, in the state of Minnesota, residential addiction treatment can range in price from $200 a month. This is residential, so you're getting 3 hots and a cot, 3 hot meals, and your 3 meals of a day and a place to sleep, as well as treatment. That could tally to $200 a month, or could range to as much as $1,065 a day. And that's just here in the state of Minnesota that I am aware of. That's extremely wide-ranging price for addiction treatment. Now, treatment for regular folks, and by that I mean people who are not physicians, has a 40 to 60% success rate. And that means 40 to 60% of people are likely to be abstinent 1 year after treatment. But treatment for physicians has a 78% success rate. And that's 5 years after treatment. 78% of physicians who've entered treatment are still abstinent. So we have these wildly ranging success rates. And that's partly because physicians and nurses, and state by state this varies, but if they develop a substance use disorder and they want to keep their medical license and their professional licenses, they have a very long extended treatment period of up to 5 years, oftentimes, and of course this varies from state to state, and they always use an abstinence-based solution for recovery rather than a harm reduction solution. And they have something to lose because their recovery is contingent upon their professional license, and those are some of the reasons for these disparities. All right, I'm taking a quick glance at the time. We're doing well. We have about 6 minutes to go before we switch over to the topic of these images we get from popular culture about addiction that fuels our sense of confusion. But in the 6 minutes we have, I will present on the topic of what is addiction recovery. The first point I want to make is the term cease and desist that we're more familiar with from the criminal justice realm. But this makes a lot of sense in the realm of addiction recovery as well. To me, cease is to stop, and to desist is to stay stopped. And both components are absolutely essential for addiction recovery. it brings to mind this quote attributed to Mark Twain. "It's easy to quit smoking. I've done it hundreds of times." So in this quote is talking about ceasing, like being able to stop. But desistance would speak to being able to stay stopped. So when we meet someone who is in recovery, that person may get a lot of questions like, that was a long time ago that you stopped drinking. How come, for example, you're still going to AA meetings? Or how come you're still not drinking? And it's because when people think about that instant of stopping drinking or stopping an addictive behavior, it's kind of like people are thinking about it as a discrete event that happens once in the far past, like graduating high school. We all remember graduating high school. Maybe it's a vague memory. It took a couple of hours in the morning or an afternoon. We might remember what we wore, who was there, what color the gowns were. And then you graduate high school, and you don't keep graduating high school all the days of the whole rest of your life. But in addiction recovery, you stop at that. There is that day when the person has their first 24 hours substance-free, and that day may be long in the past, like high school graduation was long in the past, but that person still has to stay stopped. This idea of desistance, that person still has to stay stopped, hopefully optimally, each and every day for the whole rest of their lives. So recovery for many is a very active process and something that effort is needed to stay stopped, some days more than others. But that effort means that addiction recovery is less like graduating high school, and it's more like going to the gym. It's kind of like something that's active that has to be done over and over again. To get the benefits of going to the gym, you have to keep going more than once. You have to keep going and keep going and keep going. And that's true of much that's good for us and healthy for us. Moving on, I wanted to present a couple of professional and scholarly definitions of recovery. I have my eye on the time, and what I'm going to do here is just briefly summarize. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration came up with this definition of addiction recovery. I'm not going to read it out now. I'm going to give you the chance to read it later on the slides. I want to say also that the Betty Ford Institute convened a consensus panel, and they defined addiction recovery, a voluntarily maintained lifestyle comprised of sobriety, personal health, and citizenship. If we compared the two definitions, we would find that both have an emphasis on health and abstinence, both have an emphasis on community and citizenship, that is the social circles, concentric circles of systems that the person is involved in. Both have an emphasis on increasing life meaning and purpose, and both have a sense that recovery is more than just abstinence, more than just stopping drinking. It is stopping drinking for sure, but it's abstinence plus a lot of other changes and a lot of other effortful intentions to build a healthy and sober, solid life. There have been some super major advances in addiction recovery, and I want to go over them very briefly now. This is a grassroots movement that started in the late 1990s called the Addiction Recovery Movement, and it has made a real impact on the way we perceive addiction and recovery and on the people's lives in recovery. And the largest national organizing body of this movement is called Faces and Voices of Recovery. And there's a screenshot from their website. Over 23 million Americans are in recovery from addiction to alcohol and other drugs. And advertising back in last year, big Texas rally for recovery. So the addiction recovery movement helped us in three ways. One, it put a face to recovery. I'll say a bit more about that. It offers in our communities recovery community resources, often offered in recovery community centers where people in recovery can go and get services. It offers a place for people to advocate politically for policy and services that support treatment and recovery. But what they mean about putting a face to recovery is this. They have this thought that they put forward. That is, we all know what active addiction looks like when it's, of course, when it's at its most severe end stages. Like we could look at a picture of someone and say, yeah, that person looks like a chronic alcoholic or someone who has been addicted to other drugs, you know. So, but when that person comes into recovery and they start to look like just all the rest of us, like our neighbors and our co-workers and people we know, then we stop visually knowing who those people are. They blend in. This is a website called IamNotAnonymous.org, and it's all about showing the faces of people who are in recovery so the public start to see that people in recovery look healthy and they look just like the rest of us. And a film that came out, a very important film to this movement, is called The Anonymous People. This can be streamed online and through various sources. And this is a movie about this idea of people in recovery not being anonymous because there's then no face and there's no way to dismantle stigma or to dismantle misperceptions. Here we go. We are basically right on time. We're ready to transition to our discussion of some of the mixed messages we get about addiction and recovery from popular culture. And I define that very broadly. For example, here is a greeting card that I found at Target. So friends, laughs, eats, and sweets. Friends is represented by party hats. Laughs is represented by a lineup of cocktails, eats, and sweets. So, you know, just to stop and ask, what are the kinds of messages that that are being offered to us by these kinds of, really, they're kind of everywhere, these images in popular culture. So this is associating alcohol consumption with laughs. And it's just, okay, that's interesting to note that it is, this greeting card is making that association, and it's making a positive association with these cocktails and something positive having to do with friendship and an upside of drinking. I want to show you another exemplar, another cultural artifact. This is a product called Ocean Salt, and it's a face and body scrub. It's not meant to be ingested. You don't eat this or drink it. This is something you rub on your skin. It's a product. But look at what it says on the packaging. It says, a vodka-infused cocktail for bright, fresh skin. Go coconuts with our best-selling sea salt scrub. Okay, and then if you turn that container around, it says, good to know, this is a direct quote, just like a slammer cocktail, invigorating, a bit naughty, and with a bit of a kick. So this stuff you're going to scrub on your skin is being associated with a metaphor here to a slammer cocktail. And it's being associated with rather positive aspects of a slammer cocktail, even though a slammer cocktail, let's say, is defined by something that someone drinks very, very quickly, either in one swallow or one or two gulps. That is actually a representation of binge drinking, which has a very high risk factor associated with poor outcomes. And yet this product is being showcased in a positive way by leveraging what we feel as a society is kind of positive and exciting and invigorating about a slammer cocktail, which is actually bad for public health. Now, on the current website, they changed the metaphor for this product. They're calling it now a vodka margarita, which exfoliates and cleanses tired skin. Generous portions of fine and coarse sea salt line the rim of an enriching facial scrub to wash away everyday grime. So here they're associating this body scrub with a margarita and the idea of salt around the rim, and it's associating the idea of a margarita with something that is going to cleanse us and take us and be positive for us, which is it's leveraging a social perception about alcohol. That it's just interesting to note these things and to ask, what message am I getting? I want to point next to another example. This is Katy Perry, and you might be familiar with her very popular song, Last Friday Night. The song is upbeat and super danceable. It is a happy song. It is one that you want to get up and move to. The music video adds another layer to this. It's a song about a party where most of the people got drunk. Basically, if I were to paraphrase. The music video adds another layer, and this screenshot is one from the music video. In the screenshot, Katy Perry, in the opening scenes, she's actually wearing a headgear that a young person would wear if they have braces. So it's almost suggesting that she's a child in this video, depicting a party where a lot of young people are getting drunk. And even in the video, her parents come to the door at one point, suggesting this is a young person still living at home with their parents, maybe even a child who's drinking quite heavily with friends. Now, in the lyrics of this song, I can actually identify criteria for an alcohol use disorder. Here are some of the lyrics from the song. I'm not going to sing them for you. I'm not going to actually repeat them to you. But you might be already familiar with this very well-known song. And in it, I can find that the lyrics seem to suggest criteria for an alcohol use disorder from the DSM that we talked about earlier. In red, we see evidence for drinking that could increase a person's harm of getting hurt. In blue, we see evidence for having a memory blackout, an alcoholic blackout. And in green, we see that the people are going to do it all over again, even though it caused trouble. So why don't I just be silent for just a few minutes so you can connect the red, the blue, and the green. And of course, you can study this on a handout as well. This I find fascinating. In television depictions of addiction recovery, the protagonist usually relapses. So we ask ourselves, what is the image we're getting from TV, fictional characters on TV who are in recovery? We come to know through the storyline that they used to have a substance use or an alcohol problem, and as we watch, inevitably, in most cases, they relapse because that's where the dramatic tension is. There's no real dramatic tension with a character who stays sober because it's kind of boring. They're just like everyone else. There's no upheaval there. So check this out. This is from a piece on the Fix website by Ackerman, 10 TV characters who relapsed. I'm going to go through this really quickly because I want to stop for questions very soon. 10 characters who relapsed and why they relapsed. And I think I threw in a few extras of my own. Herman Duck Phillips from Mad Men relapsed. Tommy Gavin from Rescue Me. House of Cards, we had two characters in recovery who relapsed. Christopher from The Sopranos relapsed. Bubbles from The Wire. Gregory House relapsed. Hank Moody relapsed. Jane Margolis from Breaking Bad, she relapsed. Sam Malone from Cheers relapsed. Adam Sackler from Girls relapsed. Jackie Payton from Nurse Jackie was in her addiction at the beginning of the series and sort of goes in and out of recovery throughout the series, but doesn't cleanly come into recovery. She has some trouble and she relapses. This is one character who may never have relapsed from The West Wing, if you're familiar with this show, did not relapse or did not relapse yet. I want to show you that sometimes it isn't only fictional characters who give us misperceptions about the nature of addiction recovery, but sometimes it's real people who we are familiar with who are TV personalities. I invite you to go on YouTube and search for Amy Schumer's interview on David Letterman, which happened on November 7th, 2014. So if you search that in YouTube, you'll find the video. I invite you to advance to 4 minutes and 13 seconds. And what you'll hear is David Letterman asking Amy Schumer about drinking. And she's going to make a lot of comments about her drinking behavior. And you'll notice the audience laughs uproariously. People think that jokes about drinking are very, very, very funny. You'll notice that for a while. Then you'll notice David Letterman announces he has not had a drink in over 30 years. In the next scene, David Letterman takes out a bottle of scotch. He pours 2 glasses for Amy and for himself, and after telling the audience that he hasn't had a drink in 30 years, he does not pick up the glass and begin to drink it. For a comic boost, he just starts drinking straight out of the bottle. This is profoundly confusing to us as viewers about the nature of addiction recovery. He has just said he doesn't drink anymore, and there he's just blown it right in front of our very eyes. He has resumed drinking right there on live television, and what the heck just happened? All for comic effect. Now, if you read about this scene on Wikipedia, it tells us when David Letterman is shown drinking what appears to be alcohol, it is actually substituted with apple juice by the crew. All done for a stunt, but if you don't dig into it, you really don't know what the heck happened there. So again, just to conclude, and our timing is just about right, we have 10 minutes left in which I warmly welcome your comments and your questions. So just to summarize some of the things we've hit on in this 40 minutes together, 50 minutes together, the reasons there are misconceptions about alcohol, because it is like other conditions we are more familiar with, other chronic conditions, mental illnesses, and allergies, but it's not like those other conditions. It's similar but different. The onset of addiction can be gradual, and in its early stages, problems can be intermittent rather than consistent, so it makes us confused about whether the person really does or doesn't have a problem. There's much shame and stigma still. There are aspects of addiction that are controversial, and we get mixed messages from popular culture. So that summarizes what I had prepared for you. And again, thank you for my opportunity to serve you in this way by telling you a little bit about some of my thoughts as I immerse myself in this work in my research and other academic studies. And also thank you for allowing me to serve the University of Minnesota and be a professor at your university. This is a great place. So now I also offer you some references of things I referred to today that'll be on the handout, and I turn it over to you, John, to see if there's any questions I might be able to answer.
Thank you so much, Amy. Again, if you have any questions, we have some time before the webinar ends around 1 p.m. So if you have any questions, just type them into the question pane of GoToWebinar. This question came from someone who I think has logged off since, but I'll just throw it out there as a starter, but you don't need a lengthy response. This person's question was a little bit more about, like, I guess maybe research that's that may or may have been done around like internet or online addiction, as far as people's behavior with technology. And obviously it's a little bit different than substances, but I didn't know in your field as far as if that comes up at all.
Sure, and I'd like to go back to one of my earlier slides, so I'm going to zip backward as I take this question. So the idea here is that for some people, use of the internet is starting to have a harmful impact on their life and well-being in many of the same ways that, here we go, zipping backward in time here through the slide deck. Many of the themes that define an addictive disorder, for example, use of the internet is causing social, physical, and mental trouble. Use of the internet interferes with other aspects of life. There's a sense of loss of control. When they log on, they can't get off. Mm-hmm. So the relationship with use of the internet starts to have these properties that have long been associated with addictive disorders. So there is some new research on the idea of internet addiction. People are starting to say, hey, this human behavior is starting to have the properties of addiction for some people. Mm-hmm. And there is some work on that being done on that. I haven't read that work in depth.
Sure. But I imagine kind of like these themes you're laying out, like somebody had also made a mention about like gambling addiction and things like that, but where, like as you were talking about some of these behaviors where it starts interfering with day-to-day life, I imagine like gambling would be kind of another non-substance type thing that people often think about as far as kind of a non-substance addiction.
Absolutely. They call them process addictions or behavioral addictions, gambling, sex addiction, for some people shopping, eating disorders.
Sure. All right. Well, I'll go just, we've got a few in here, so we'll kind of maybe do a lightning round here. Has there been any studies, or have you done any studies on what effects what effect depictions of substance abuse have on people attempting to recover?
Oh, wonderful question. In other words, when someone is attempting to recover, how do they respond to like a greeting card with alcohol on it or
Yep.
a alcohol advertising? I think it's an absolutely wonderful question. I have not myself studied this, but in a person's environment, there are going to be a lot of psychosocial cues that will cue the person and get them to perhaps have a craving to return to the substance. And these cultural indicators would be part of that, this greater, broader sense of artifacts and social components in a person's environment that trigger them to drink. It could be walking by a bar that they used to drink or seeing friends they used to drink with. This has long been known in treatment communities and in research on treatment that what a person needs to do is reduce their exposure to these high-risk situations. But of course, if a bus goes by with an alcohol ad on the side of it, you can't really avoid that. But it's an excellent question.
Yeah. From your experience with the research that's focused on addiction, do you see, has the research found any differences? Let me read it here. Any differences in the findings between rural communities and more urban areas, as far as I don't know if it's higher rates of addiction or just different themes that play out between urban and rural? Anything that you've seen in your academic experience?
Sure. I have started a new study on the experience of treatment and recovery in rural southeast Minnesota. And first of all, there hasn't been a lot of research on the topic of the experience of rural recovery from addiction, but what is out there suggests that people in rural communities might have a harder time because of longer wait lists to treatment being at a long distance far away from home, needing a car to drive a long distance to get to a treatment center. Even 12-step meetings, Alcoholics Anonymous, won't be as frequent. There won't be as many kind of diverse kinds of meetings for the person to choose from. But in my study so far, I'm also finding there are a lot of strengths in rural communities for addiction recovery. For example, a great sense of community and a sense of being there for your neighbor and a sense of solidarity with neighbors that can actually support recovery.
Absolutely.
So that's what I know so far.
Another attendee asks, please comment more on minimizing harm as an alternative to abstinence.
Sure. There's a treatment initiative called harm reduction, and that represents a series, a body of treatment interventions where the person is not expected or asked to achieve abstinence immediately and then to start working within the realm of an abstinence point of view. So when I was a substance use counselor in the mid-1990s, I worked for an abstinence-based treatment program. And when the patient came in, we told them, now please discontinue use of these addictive substances and enter treatment with us, come to groups, come to individual sessions, and we'll work with you, but our requirement for treatment here is abstinence. So there are other types of treatment interventions where they may let the person continue to use the substances. In other words, they don't mandate that the person become abstinent at the beginning, but they let them continue to drink while we continue to explore the role of drinking in their lives, maybe a program to help the person support in reducing their drinking rather than stopping altogether. And if the person has not yet developed an alcohol use disorder, that may be an extremely viable path for them. And of course, harm reduction also relates to things like methadone maintenance, where the person discontinues use of heroin, for example, substitutes methadone, which is a more stable, still an addictive substance, but is less erratic and lasts in the body for longer periods and does not lead to that constant drug-seeking behavior. And the person may be able to function quite well maintained on methadone. So that would be considered harm reduction instead of abstinence.
Excellent. We have a few more questions. Do you have maybe a couple more minutes past one that I could fire some questions by you?
I sure do.
Okay, we'll maybe do about 5 more minutes tops, and because we've had some great questions coming online. Another attendee asked, "What do you think about language and stigma? For example, you said the lay term used is alcoholic, and the technical term is alcohol use disorder. Do you
Mm-hmm.
think the term alcoholic, or by their diagnosis, contributes to stigma?"
Yes, there has been a lot of writing about this, that an old term called actually substance abuse is actually considered now to be a stigmatizing term, even though that term is still used all over the place. So listen, our language changes, and it changes quite rapidly with relevance to addiction. We no longer call people drunkards anymore or inebriates. So those terms are they're out of fashion, they're out of style, they're inappropriate terms, they're disparaging terms. And now even substance abuse is considered a disparaging term. And substance use disorder, a person, so person first, a person with a substance use disorder is kind of like the current politically correct, if you will, or current accurate way, more dignified way to address someone. Now, the thing about alcoholic is I personally do not consider alcoholic a disparaging term. Others may, because the term alcoholic has been adopted by the community of Alcoholics Anonymous not as a disparaging term, but as a statement of fact, a statement of truth. So that the AA literature uses the term alcoholic and alcoholism, and it doesn't conflict with a good positive life in recovery, but some disagree with the use of those terms.
Sure. Another person asks, it's kind of that fine line between when are you understanding and accepting the disease and when are you enabling the disease?
Yes.
So that's
right.
kind of like maybe as a researcher, how do you distinguish that, or how do people end up distinguishing that?
Absolutely. And I just wanted to put this slide up. Listen, having a loved one or a friend who has an addictive disorder is extremely challenging. And this is just my own personal opinion, I feel the family and the friends may even suffer more than the person with the addiction. And it's very hard and confusing. Where are the lines between, as the viewer has articulated, understanding and accepting and enabling? And I think learning those fine shades of meaning can come from attending, for example, open meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous, which welcome the public, and then hearing people with alcohol use disorders telling the stories will help and aid with understanding what the illness really is all about. And certainly understanding and acceptance is important, and enabling, that is doing for that person things that they should do for themselves, is often thought of as not terribly helpful.
Sure. One other, actually a comment contributed by one of the viewers in regards to when you mentioned your rural community study.
Yes.
He mentions Albert Lee, Minnesota. They have a Blue Zones community, and that person was just wanting to send it along because she was wondering if that's made a difference with recovery. So passing that feedback to you from an attendee today.
Blue Zones, I'm going to look that up. That's very important to me. Thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah. Actually, this will be the last question. How do we deal with the negative reputation that treatment programs get for addicts?
Okay, so I'd like to know more about what that person was thinking. Negative reputation that treatment programs have for addicts. In other words, that the people with addictions feel bad about a certain treatment program.
Yeah, or the stigma that, I'm maybe assuming, but like if I'm having to go into a treatment program, or having to go to Hazelden or Betty Ford, that there's a social stigma with that,
Yes.
or a feeling of
Again,
failure, or I couldn't do this all on my own.
absolutely. Absolutely. And this is why, to me, addiction is like nothing else that we experience as human beings, because there's stigma related to asking for help. There's stigma related to going for help, stigma related to not going for help and remaining someone with an active addiction. And it almost seems like a person should just stop on their own. And one of the things that's validated over and over again in my work is this idea that to successfully recover, that idea of cease and desist, to stop and stay stopped, what's needed is social support. You need social support for people who support recovery. There can be social support for that people who want you to drink again. You know, that's the kind of social support that's not helpful. But social support, family members and friends that support abstinence, that support recovery, this idea of desistance is almost not possible without social support. And that's what people get when they plug in, if they choose to plug into Alcoholics Anonymous or other recovery groups like Women for Sobriety or Smart Recovery, is they get a group of other people who are going to support them in their efforts to stop and stay stopped. So it seems like that just that stigma is hard to shake. You know, again, that example from the qualitative study of even a student who doesn't drink in some college campuses, they're going to be stigmatized. So I think people need to just understand that if they're doing what's good for them and doing what's healthy for them, then that is good and right, and the idea of stigma will reduce and fade into the background because they're making such an incredibly powerful and courageous step for their own wellness and well-being that the idea of stigma will just fade in the background because of that kind of in the face of that kind of courage.
Absolutely, and I think that's just a great note to conclude on, and appreciate you kind of going into overtime here. We had a lot of great questions and feedback from the audience, and just really appreciate the time and expertise that you've shared with our audience today. Thank you so much, Amy.
Thank you, John.
All right, everyone. Thank you again to Dr. Amy Krensman of the School of Social Work, which is in the College of Education and Human Development at the University of Minnesota. Lots of great work happening within the School of Social Work. As she mentioned, they're going to be celebrating their 100th anniversary very soon, and a lot of good work in the College of Education and Human Development. So if you haven't checked out the research coming out of there, I strongly encourage you to do so. And again, we have some upcoming webinars that will be coming up. You can check all those out at umnalumni.org/virtual. And that's the conclusion of today's webinar. Again, just want to repeat that members of the University of Minnesota Alumni Association make initiatives like this webinar series possible. We thank each and every one of you. Your help really brings together our global community of alumni and friends. And if you'd like to become a member, you can learn more at umnalumni.org/membership. That's the conclusion of today's webinar. We will have a video link that I'll email to all registrants probably a couple days after we conclude this afternoon. Just need some time to get it up on our YouTube channel, and I'll also include Dr. Krensman's PDF as well of the slides if you'd like that for review. Thanks again for joining over the noon hour if you're here on Central Time or wherever you are in the world. Have a wonderful day, and go Gophers.